Good morning, everyone. This is Deb Kidwell with SNAC, and we welcome you to today's webinar, From a Culture of Accommodation to a Culture of Accessibility, the Wichita State Story. We're going to get started in about 5 minutes, but we were kind of curious about one thing today. How many of you are actually joining our webinar from home? If you could just raise your hand, we greatly appreciate it. It looks like about half of you are working from home, so I'm assuming the other half are working from your office. We really appreciate you joining us with everything that's going on right now in the world and our institutions. We truly appreciate the time, and just bear with us and we will get started in about 3 minutes. I know we're getting ready and approaching the 1 o'clock hour. I also know that I had a little problem getting dialed in this morning, so I think most of these remote webinars and meeting systems are being tested today. So we'll give everybody just another second or two to get dialed in, and then we'll get started. If you are having any problems seeing the slides or hearing me, of course, just let us know through the chat box. Okay, well, let's go ahead and get things started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Deb Kidwell, and I work with the Midwestern Higher Education Compact. And again, we greatly appreciate everyone being here today in these times. Today we have Mr. John Jones, who is Director of the Media Resource Center at Wichita State University, joining us to tell their story of their journey from accommodation to accessibility. Before we begin the presentation, just a few housekeeping items. This session is being recorded. We will be taking questions through the question box in your control section. You may hear at times some of the next staff in the background if they have some questions or some assistance, so don't be surprised if you hear that. We certainly couldn't do this without them, trust me, so we really appreciate their help and support. And last but not least, the handouts are attached to the session. We will not be mailing those out. What we will mail out after the session is a recording. But the handouts, if you want those are attached in the session, and you need to go ahead and download those now. With that said, I would like to turn everything over to Mr. Jones. John?
Hello. I'm just making sure my voice is coming through. It looks like I'm good. My name's John Jones, and I am the director of the Media Resources Center at Wichita State University. Let me apologize here up front. I'm sure, like everybody else on this call and who will be watching this recording, at the time of this webinar, our institution, like everybody else, is scrambling and trying to deal with the new reality of going online. So a lot of my energies have been going into that. And so this is not a very pretty presentation. It is meeting the new standard of the post-COVID-19 getting out of the spring semester reality, which is it is adequate. So I hope you can appreciate the adequacy of this presentation. But this is what we're going to be doing. And I probably have too many slides, so I may move kind of quickly. This is me. Like I said, I'm the director of the Media Resources Center. I have worked in higher ed, in K-12, in small startups, and in Fortune 500 companies in my weird and storied career, or varied career. So I have seen a lot of different things, but currently I'm running the Media Resources Center, which includes campus media services, video services, instructional design and access, who are the folks who are primarily really busy right now. And our web services team also has plenty to do. And the team that is mostly involved with a lot of the stuff that we'll be talking with today, which is academic accessibility and accommodations. Then we have, we are part of academic affairs. I should point out that at many institutions, at least about 2/3 of them, these sorts of services are included in IT, but at Wichita State, we have a IT structure and then the media resources structure. So we have an unusual, I think the media centers are a sort of dinosaur design that existed now, or exists now only in smaller pockets. So having said all that, let's start off with a quick poll question. There we go. Who is responsible for accessibility at your institution? So just click on a quick answer and let us know what you think.
Yeah. See, about half of you voted. We'll give you a few more seconds. All right. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll.
Great. Okay, so it looks like a lot of institutions are relying on their disability services office or have a dedicated accessibility office. Looks like IT has been getting away with not having to be very responsible for this at the very least, and that's not atypical, I don't think, although at a lot of institutions who have been faced with challenges like ours, we see that the IT groups need to be very involved. So we'll just go ahead and move on. All right, so the beginning of our story with the National Federation of the Blind. What happened for us was we had a completely blind adult student who was working through a pre-med program. She's a Braille reader and user, was taking the upper division chemistry and biology classes that were required for her major. And there was there was insufficient support for her in disability services. They were farming out the Braille work that needed to be done to a third party who wasn't getting the materials to us fast enough. The tactile graphics that are necessary to convey a lot of the ideas weren't adequate to her needs. And there wasn't enough work being done to try and do anything other than textbooks for the student. They had a student aide who would work with her in the class, but the challenges were just too great and the student kept falling behind. And eventually she filed a complaint with the NFB, and the university signed an agreement with the NFB that gave us 4 years to become accessible. And that has involved this major transformation that we are in the process of going through right now. This sort of transformation is, of course, this sort of thing that you never really quite finish. But we had a lot of work to do and needed to really put our nose to it. So our agreement actually fits into a larger legal landscape that I wanted to talk through. There was a civil rights or Office of Civil Rights consent decree at Atlantic Cape Community College that came out before ours, and that really set a bunch of new standards for how students would be accommodated and what the standards would be for those accommodations. So this is a really important, very significant change in the way these civil rights laws are being applied. And in most cases, we don't see civil rights law stepping backwards. So that OCR consent decree became the basis for our agreement. And Atlantic Cape Community College had 3 years to try and meet the needs of their students and become accessible. We had 4, and there were some slight differences in ours. After us came Southern Oregon University, who had a very similar resolution agreement with the National Federation of the Blind. Their agreement gave them 5 years, so they have a little bit of time. I also think it's important to be aware of the other end of the spectrum. If you're not going to work with the OCR or with the National Federation of the Blind, there is the example of the LA Community College District, who last summer were they were taken to court. The court case finally ended last summer, and I believe that the resolution ended up in a settlement of about $40,000 to the students involved, and then several $1 million in court costs to cover the NFB's court costs. So it was a very expensive decision to go that way, and they then ended with a federal court command to make themselves accessible in 1 year. So they had the millions of dollars of expense for the court costs, and then the expense of getting all 9 colleges in the community college district accessible. So none of us want to go there or deal with that, but those sorts of risks are out there as we look at these possible challenges. All right, so the important points from our agreement with the NFB are that it gave us 4 years. It included an electronic and information technology audit. It includes all instruction, student experience websites, and web-based tools. And in our case, because the students' bad experience was in face-to-face classes, we have to worry about the face-to-face accessibility for instruction and other parts of campus. So it's not just online, which a lot of the agreements focus on. So one of the things that we try and really focus on is making a distinction between accommodations and accessibility. So accommodations are what we do as a reaction to a specific person who shows up and has needs. It targets those individual needs. It doesn't do anything for anybody else. And because they target specific needs, they can be more challenging, but are usually supported by disability services, whatever your office is called. So we might be providing a sign language interpreter, which is expensive because we have to pay the hourly rate for that sign language interpreter, but it serves just one student, maybe another student in the class if there happen to be 2. Accessibility, on the other hand, is what we do proactively. It's what we do to create a version of content, or make sure that all of our content and tools are accessible or usable by somebody with a variety of disabilities. So it targets populations, not individuals, and it can be in lived experience, it can be less complicated than accommodations because we don't have to meet the needs, the very specific needs of an individual. But the scope of the challenge means that it requires absolutely everybody to contribute. So everybody who is developing content that's going to be used in the class, everybody who's putting content online, everybody who is developing content using Word or PowerPoint or Excel or Adobe, anything that's being created and distributed needs to be accessible, or accessible alternatives need to be available. So an example of this is if we have a textbook that's available in a screen reader accessible PDF format, then that meets the accessibility standards. We might, as an accommodation later, have to create a Braille version of that textbook for a student who requires Braille. But while we are working on that Braille, the student can still access the screen reader version, and so they have access to the content even if it's not in their preferred format. So one of the key factors in all of this for the accessibility stuff we have to hit is this same time standard. Content needs to be available at the exact same time for everyone. So live captions on live video are critical. Textbook and formats that can be read by screen readers are critical, rather than having to wait for that Braille or wait for that audio recording if it's being created. We can use the user's technology to deliver a lot of this. So one of the things that we've done on campus quite a bit is post QR codes, often with some sort of touchable indicator that lets people know there's something there, that have a web-based version of that content so that the person can access the content that way. So we'll go from that into poll question 2. So which of these are accessible practices based on what we've been talking about? So do you think that providing, and you can select one or more, providing extra time on exams for students, selecting textbooks that are available as accessible ebooks, providing video with captions, providing alt text for all images, or providing a sign language interpreter for a deaf student?
See, the votes are coming in. We'll give you a few more seconds.
Sure.
All right. Looks like most have voted. Give a couple more coming in.
Cool.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll.
All right, yeah, so video with captions, obviously, alt text for images is important. Providing sign language for a specific deaf student would not be an accessibility practice. However, if we provided a sign language interpreter for an event without knowing that there would be deaf users there or deaf attendees there, that would be accessible. So the same sort of remediation can be accessibility or accommodation, so it can be confusing. A lot of it is thinking about what triggers the practice. Selecting textbooks that are available as accessible ebooks is absolutely an accessibility practice. And extra time on exams is usually something that we provide as an accommodation. It wouldn't necessarily be something we would do for all students. So let's get back to my adequate slides. All right. So I think I just covered this. Accessibility is proactive, accommodations are reactive, and I already said all that. So we'll just keep going. So these are some key considerations for policies as you, if you get asked to look at your policies or contribute to them. You're going to have to think about how we define accessible. And this is what we wrote. You'll see that there's lots of standards, but accessibility standards are based on the ADA, Section 504 requirements, and applicable regulations, and will be updated as new standards emerge. And then we have a list of other standards. The key one there is the WCAG 2.0 AA. We wrote that before 2.1 came out, so there is a WCAG 2.1. There's also an AAA standard that most folks aren't asked to hold themselves to, but it gives us something to aspire towards. But depending upon the type of media you're working with, there may be other standards, and this is a good list of them. And this is for our discussion about what needs to be accessible. We have all university-owned or contracted content, interfaces, and navigation elements to be used by WSU faculty, staff, students, or other WSU constituencies will be compliant with the ADA as amended and will be accessible to people with disabilities. There's a key, that last phrase there, and will be accessible to people with disabilities, means that we can't just hit those standards and call it good. There's this very relatively fuzzy but important piece of it there that lets us know that it does actually need to be accessible as well. Sometimes it's possible to meet the standards in a disingenuous way that doesn't really make that accessible. You know, like putting a push button for a door in the wrong place so that it doesn't actually make the door very usable or something like that. So that's what we're trying to account for there. And then thinking about who is responsible. Any content that is produced needs to be accessible. Interfaces that are programmed or created need to be accessible. Events and experiences need to be as accessible as possible. So not everyone leads or has the expertise. No single team can do this for everyone. We all need to own our piece of it. And that's why this attempt at culture change becomes so important. You can have an accessibility lead, somebody who represents and is the face of accessibility on campus. And that's a thing I'll recommend later. But at the same time, it's not something that is covered or taken care of by anyone. Everybody needs to own a piece of it. And that's pretty unusual in a higher ed situation. So poll question 3. Does your institution have and enforce strong accessibility policies? So you either have strong policies and they are regularly enforced, you have strong policies but they are not typically enforced, or you don't have strong policies, or you actually don't know and you'll go look it up later.
See, the votes are still coming in. Give another few seconds.
It is really nice having a wingman for this.
Glad I could help. All right. Give me one more second. Okay, I'm going to close the poll.
So it looks like most people don't have strong policies, but we're seeing some policies that exist but aren't being typically enforced, and only a relatively small percentage are in a place where they feel like they have strong policies and they're being enforced. This is really, really difficult work. It is very hard to build urgency around the idea that accessibility is something people should be working on, especially without a major agreement with the NFB or some other outside external force that is forcing you into a situation where you have to actually try and achieve that. Doing it based on your own motivation can be very difficult. But I think that what we're seeing in a lot of the cases that are coming out, both in the higher ed sector and in the broader sector, things like the Domino's settlement, where Domino's had to make their website accessible and for users trying to buy pizza online, that sort of thing. Those decisions are demonstrating that the standards have shifted and we really do need to be paying attention to this. And so as higher ed institutions, we are preparing the people who will be going into those jobs. We need to be making sure that we're modeling that behavior. So let's get back to my adequate slides. All right, so how do we go about moving that needle? To be clear, Wichita State isn't there yet. We've made a lot of really good progress, but true culture change is a big deal. What I will say, and I think this is very important, when we started talking to faculty and we had to build trainings and we were delivering trainings face-to-face and trying to send that message out there, we had to deal with a lot of very, very angry resistance, a lot of I have academic freedom and you can't make us do this, or what are you going to do if I don't, and that sort of resistance. And now the strongest resistance we get from faculty isn't you can't make me, it's I don't know how to do that. Who's going to show me? And so they understand that it is something that they need to do. They're just at a loss for how to get it done. And that is where my teams, again, can step in and really help them. So that alone is a significant enough culture change to really celebrate and see how we're able to move forward from here. So let's talk about a little bit of what we've been able to do. We've gone through just making people aware, and that took a lot of announcements about the agreement and training about the policies and stuff like that. I just talked about that attitude shift. We are providing a ton of training and ways to review people's websites and stuff like that that they're producing, so that we are able to help people produce more accessible stuff. We have actually also improved our systems for accommodations to make sure that we stay out of trouble on that side. We've built an office that is that AAA office I talked about. That's a brand new team within the Media Resources Center that does Braille and tactile graphics for our students. And we're doing all of that work now in-house rather than farming it out so that we can respond as quickly as possible. And we have lots of systems that we're using to try and gather data about what's going on and make sure that we're remediating them. So it's particularly difficult to promote this kind of change because it does mean that everybody needs to learn new things. I mean, if you just think about some of the very basic things, you can make a Word document accessible very simply if you always remember to use the styles bar rather than just making headers bigger and bolder and underline them manually. It's actually easier to do that, but it is a habit change for most of us who are using Word, and that becomes complicated. So it's just a lot of those sorts of behaviors and changes that people need to do. It's not necessarily more work, but the idea that it's different is complicated. We need to be looking at who is remediating web pages and who can help clean that up. We need to be really looking at how we select textbooks and tools that are used for instruction and for other things besides instruction. And we need to be looking at the processes like purchasing so that accessibility becomes part of the process of reviewing a product before it is bought or contracted by the university. So on a particular campus, you're going to need top-level support. You're going to need to be able to reach across divisions and be able to get people on your side. And that's only really possible with top-level support. You need to be communicating well with mid-level administration to make sure that they own the pieces of their responsibility, the things that they need to take care of. So in our case, we needed to communicate through a lot of meetings and a lot of conversations with the university library, because so much of their web products and their databases and their indexes and stuff like that need to be accessible. And because I'm outside of IT, I had to work with our IT unit to make sure that the web apps and things that they program for taking care of student business are accessible. We need to have academic leadership that supports things. So your deans, your provost, your other folks at that level. We need to have advocates who will go and speak to the faculty senate, and they need to be persuasive. They need to not just be delivering a message that says, oh, it's federal law, we have to do this. They need to be talking about why it's important and why we need to serve all of our students, and really be ready to handle a lot of the pushback. Department heads need to be on board to deliver the message to their departments, and our individual contributors need to learn and adapt and develop those new skills. So this is something that everybody needs to contribute to. I see your video, Deb, but you haven't come in on audio.
That would be because I'm muted.
I'm still not hearing
So
you.
we have.
There you are.
There, okay, good. We've had a question come in that given the current changes in academia due to the pandemic, what considerations do you suggest to meet accessibility right now?
So the first thing to do is to be very careful to maintain the integrity of the current accommodations that you're providing. So if you are providing sign language interpreters for a student who is in a class that has suddenly been moved online, that you're going to have to work with Zoom or something else to try and make sure that either captions or the sign language interpreter is provided for that student. That can look like a lot of different things. A lot depends upon what your resources you have and how you want to try and solve that problem. But that's the first problem you have to solve. The captions thing is especially, I mean, most people are going to be moving from live teaching to teaching online. What's going to feel most natural to them is to go to video. And what I'm telling folks around here is that anything that you can teach in text, teach in text. And that's not an accessibility recommendation, that's a bandwidth recommendation. One of the things that I really believe we're going to see is that our students are going to be trying to access the content that we produce in neighborhoods whose internet backbones are really being strained by the number of people who are trying to work from home and learn from home. That our neighborhoods were not designed to provide that much internet in most cases, especially in the less affluent neighborhoods where a lot of our students probably live. So if you can teach something in text, that's going to be a lot easier for all of your students to access, and text is the most accessible way to provide content to people with all kinds of disabilities. So that becomes an important key there. If we are producing video, one of the ways we can excuse ourselves from providing captions is if we know that we have a fixed audience that does not have a need for that accommodation, then we can provide video without captions. So that means in a Zoom session that is just your department heads or something like that, you're able to say, okay, none of the people in this meeting need captions, so I don't need to provide them. Normally, what we tell faculty when they're developing video for their online classes, we tell them, because we don't know who will be in that class, whether they'd be students who add later or students who haven't enrolled in this class, but this video is being prepared for a class that isn't live yet, then we have to provide captions because we don't know in a concrete way what that audience is. But in this specific case, the moment that we are in, you are teaching a class where we know the audience. It's past the add date for most of us. We know that there are those students in the class, and we know that if we know that none of them have those particular needs, then we can provide video without captions. But again, if you have a student in the class who's getting really any accommodation at all, even if it's an anxiety disorder thing or a learning disorder thing, you should probably be talking to your Office of Disability Services and see if there's something that you can do in the new format that will be supportive of that student's success. So that's a long answer, but I think it's important to understand the context of the standards and why it is okay to provide video without captions now. But it is not going to be okay in the future. And what I usually say is, because for most of the faculty who I'm talking to, it's folks who have not used these sorts of tools before, and they haven't considered teaching online or through video before. And we're telling them that, like these slides, adequate is good enough, everything's going to be great. But if they happen to create a video that they really love and they really want to use again, they should absolutely not do that without taking the time to make sure that that video gets captioned. So this video is one-time use only now, unless we do some other remediation with it later. So you triggered a thing I'm ready to talk about way too much. But all right, so back to our communications efforts. We get a lot of messaging from the provost about accessibility. We have an accessibility committee that includes representation from most of the major areas on campus that have a piece to be concerned about, including HR, IT, the library. We have faculty representation. We have my unit, the Media Resources Center. We have an accessibility coordinator. And for the past 3 years or so of the agreement, that has been an associate general counsel from the general counsel's office. And that person's role has been to manage the relationship with the National Federation of the Blind and make sure that we're hitting the signposts and stuff, milestones in the agreement. We have annual trainings that we create and offer, and we change those up every year so they're focusing on different things and we're not inundating people with repetitive training. And we do a lot of presentations and conversations with leadership on campus, trying to make sure that as we make new policies or integrate new systems or processes, that they're aware of it and know what's coming. But the most important thing that we have really had to do is focus on individual conversations. We've all worked with faculty, we've all worked with administrators. We know that we need to be doing that high-level messaging, those email blasts, all that other sort of thing, but people don't really hear it always until you're actually talking to them about it. So the value of some dedicated staff to work on this is that they're able to have those conversations and really impress on people the importance of it. All right, time for another poll. Which method of communication are most effective in your institution? So is it top-down messaging, email blasts, speaking to shared governance bodies, announcements on the intranet, or visiting department meetings?
Right. Votes are still coming in.
All right, people are still awake.
They are. Give a few more seconds. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and close it.
All right. So we are firm believers in both top-down messaging and visiting department meetings. I'm personally have felt like I've had the most success in the more direct conversations that I've had. So my answer on this would have been the visiting the department meetings. Top-down messaging is absolutely critical, and that sets the stage for everything else. All of the others are necessary, but we actually have an employee in the Media Resources Center who's basically our evangelist, and he does go out and visit department meetings and have individual conversations with faculty. And one of the key issues he talks about is the accessibility challenges that they're facing and how we might help them better. But the bottom line is I think all of these are important. We all know that email isn't often listened to very much, that shared governance bodies don't always share information as much as we'd like, but it's all necessary to make sure we're covering our bases. All right. Okay, so all of that is fine, but you might have gotten this from me already, but relentless constant pressure is required. People need to keep accessibility in mind. It needs to be in ways that won't overwhelm them, but it needs to provide guidance and support while you're doing it. So if that doesn't sound hard, you guys haven't been paying attention. We have several tactics I'm talking about here. We do a lot of training and have weekly tips. We have made sure that for training on other products, like all of the Microsoft products that we do training on, accessibility and how to develop accessibly is baked into that. We have the university's content management system for our website has an accessibility checker baked into it, and you can't publish a page without fixing all of the accessibility problems on the page. So all of that sort of stuff helps us drive that accessibility message to people. It's very difficult for them to get away from it. We also do, in our email blasts, we do accessibility tip of the week so that people are getting bite-sized pieces of content as they go. I mentioned our accessibility checker on our website. We also are a Blackboard Ally school, and if you're not familiar with Blackboard Ally and you have either Blackboard or Canvas, I'd recommend that you take a look at it. It is a very, very powerful tool, and this isn't an ad for it, but Ally on the fly, if a Word document or a PDF is uploaded to the learning management system, the Ally will automatically create a bunch of different versions of that document so that students can get it as HTML, which is much easier to use on a mobile device. They can get an audio version with a computer voice. And it's all available on demand from the moment the piece is uploaded. It also includes a digital Braille version. So many Braille using people have a dynamic Braille display, a device with like 5 or 6 rows of Braille pins. that dynamically move or change to represent new characters. And so Ally will automatically convert that to those things. So right out of the box, it's meeting a ton of accessibility needs. But in addition, on the instructor's side, they get a little dial that's either red, yellow, or sorry, red, orange, or green, based on how accessible the document they just uploaded is, and it gives them guidance on how to make it more accessible. It is amazing how just that dial, the gamification of that dial, has driven lots of people to bang their heads on their documents until they are accessible. So I really recommend that sort of thing. And then a last thing that we do is, because we have to think about face-to-face accessibility, we thought about how big text needs to be on the whiteboard or in projectors for a person with low vision to be able to see it. And we really want to focus on being able to see it at any part of in any part of the room. One of the realities of these sorts of civil rights law is we can't ask somebody based on being part of any group to sit in a particular part of the room. So if we wouldn't ask all redheads in the room to come sit up front, then we can't ask all people with low vision to sit in the front of the room. So we really need to think about how big things need to be for them to see it in the back of the room. And we have to have something that will address both the size on whiteboards and blackboards and the highly variable size of text as it appears on the screen. And we don't know about, it's way too variable to try and have an answer that is based on the projector and the screen and the distance and stuff like that. We are working on that data, but it's very challenging. So what we found as a simpler solution was just to put these signs up in every room right next to the whiteboard or where the screen comes down. And the students and the faculty can look at that sign and make an evaluation as to whether the sizes match and the stuff that's being presented is big enough. Our training teaches them that if it's not that big, it's not that they can't present anything that's smaller than that, but that they have to voice it if they're going to put it up there, so that there's an alternative way to get that content. Deb, do you have another question?
I have a couple of questions. I will just remind everyone that if you want copies of the slides, that they are available from within the webinar controls. Just look for the section called handouts, and you can actually download the slides and get all the tips that are being shared from that. And then after that, John, the question for you was, from a research and best practice standpoint, do you have references for the statement? If you can teach via text, you should. There's agreement with the statement, but just wanting more findings on the topic.
That's really just based on my own experience working with stuff. I don't have a specific reference for that. That's the recommendation that my folks and I are making. But because screen readers can access text very easily, and because text is going to be a lot easier to squeeze down very constrained pipes to people's homes, that's the recommendation we're making.
Great, thank you. That's it for now.
Okay, cool. All right. So I'm going to recommend a website to you later. So if you're interested in text size stickers like this, we have a website where you can get the Photoshop files to download that sticker and swap in your colors and your letters so that it looks like it's from your school, and make what other changes you need to, and then use it if you'd like at your campus, assuming we ever teach again on campus. Hey. All right, so the face of accessibility is a particular problem that I alluded to earlier, which is that it's while it is very easy to consider accommodations, usually there is somebody who is a very specific person in need, either a student or a faculty member, who has a specific impairment, and it's very easy to get support to find a way to support their needs. It's easy to get funding for sign language interpreters for a specific person. Everything about it feels good. We're doing something to meet these people's needs. That's easy. And that face of accommodations is the person who has that need. Accessibility is tougher because it doesn't have a face. The work is important, but it's not urgent. At WSU, we have some artificial urgency based on the end of our agreement with the National Federation of the Blind. But in general, this is often work that, while it's urgent, there may be important things that are coming up and that are easier to prioritize over this. And we need to really be focusing on how we can make that urgency matter enough. A lot of time there just isn't a sympathetic user who we can put in front of who can be the representative for this. And there needs to be somebody on campus who will step forward and be the person you don't want to disappoint. That's in some cases on campus here at Wichita State, that's been me. In some cases, it's been other folks. We do have a lot of people here who are passionate about this now, but it has required that kind of investment from folks. So here's some ideas on helping you get started. You need to immediately think about your public web spaces. Your public website is where you are absolutely most vulnerable. There are advocates out there in the world who are just going to university websites, identifying accessibility problem, and filing a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights. They're not your students, they're not your parents, they don't live in your state, and they have every right to file that complaint. So your public website is a really, really big risk for you, and you really should be paying attention to that. It's a bad enough web accessibility failure is plenty of problem to bring the OCR to campus and have them do a full review of everything. And that, I imagine, is unpleasant. So you really need to be looking at your website for accessibility. There are tools that will help you do that. There are companies that will help you do that. But you really need to develop the skills to understand what accessible web development looks like and make sure that your teams are developing their tools in that way. The other thing you have to keep in mind is that, and this is the very last bullet point on the page, beware your PDFs. We use tons of PDFs on university campuses, and we love our paper processes, but PDFs can be very difficult to make accessible, especially if they weren't designed from the ground up to be accessible. And every one of those, they don't exist as part of your content management system. They aren't necessarily being reviewed by that, but they're still available through the web. And if they're not accessible, that can be a point that gets you, that can be something that will get you in front of the OCR. That can be a point of complaint. So it's absolutely critical that you be paying attention to your PDFs, get PDFs down that don't matter, and the ones that do matter, make sure that they are accessible. You're going to need to conduct an EIT audit, an electronic information technology audit. All of your web-based systems, all of your physical things, you need to be thinking about anything that people interact with that plugs in. So if it's a kiosk, think about how accessible it is. If it's a touch screen, think about how accessible it is. And spoiler alert, it's not accessible. So think about how people can get the information on those screens in an alternative way if it's not accessible there. You need to stop adding to the problems that you have on campus. Right now, you have a set of tools that are not accessible, and that is a big enough problem. But if your purchasing processes and your contract processes don't prevent more problems from coming in, then you're just making things worse. And we're ready for another poll. So where do you think it makes sense to get started? Do you want to work on your public website, on your EIT audit, on your LMS, or on your instructional materials? The poll, I mean, the LMS and the instructional materials weren't in the previous slides, but those are also key points of danger, but they are not necessarily so public. They're not, they're absolutely something that needs to be considered, especially since your complaints may very well come from students in your classes like it did for us. How are we doing?
All right, it looks like most people voted, so I'll give one more second.
All right.
Gonna close it, get you your results.
Yeah, public website. I think I made that point pretty well. Instructional materials, yeah, are also really, really critical. You can save yourselves a lot of trouble. I mean, one of the things that is a really, really good value that we see from faculty is that they are using older textbooks because this particular subject matter hasn't changed in the past 20 years. Why should I make my students buy the much more expensive, newer textbooks? But the standards for what our textbooks needed to be were very different 20 years ago. And so using older textbooks is a choice that supports financial accessibility, but not actual accessibility. So it can be a very, very tough choice to make. Let's go back to my totally adequate slides. All right. All right, so where we are today. I mentioned earlier that we have the shift in the nature of our questions that are asked about accessibility. I wanted to bring up Pope.tech. Pope.tech is a company that is out there, and they're selling a product. They want to sell you services to help make your website accessible. I'm not recommending them or not recommending them, but they did something that's very interesting. They produced a report where they evaluated the top 100 or so web pages from every higher ed institution in the country. So it's like almost 4,000. It's 3,800 and change. And then you can see your ranking on those. And I'm going to show you WSU's rankings from a few days ago when I put these slides together. And that makes they can give you an idea of where you are, how you compare to other institutions, and the general accessibility of those very first pages people go to. It's not reviewing your whole site. It's not looking at, and I promise you, your worst problems are way down deep in the web pages that nobody's looked at since, 6 years ago when the photographs from that event were put up. So you need to be worrying about those things, but this is a good indication of how your practices are working and how much trouble you may be in as far as the website goes. So I'll show you those results in a minute. Just to give you a sense of our success in trying to move the needle, we have a new student who started just this spring and who is going to be taking an online master's program. And as my teams do when this sort of thing comes up, and this was another student who has very high impact needs. She was going to need Braille, she was going to need tactile graphics and that sort of thing. And what we discovered when we went in and took a look at the courses that this student was going to be taking, that 80% of the material was already accessible, and that our work was much easier because of that. And so we did not have to have the absolute disaster fire drill DEFCON 1 problems with that student because of the preparation that the faculty had been making. So while it's possible to focus on a lot of the resistance that we get, those sorts of moments where you can just sort of breathe a sigh of relief are really, really important. We have been working with the couple of museums on campus to try and promote accessibility there. A couple of years ago, while we were in the middle of the agreement, the Pizza Hut Museum on campus was being updated, and you may not know it that Pizza Hut comes from Wichita State, but Pizza Hut does, and I'm sure you'll be seeing a lot of Pizza Hut during the social isolation that we're going through. But the Pizza Hut Museum was designed in such a way that there are the QR codes to provide additional content that is on a lot of the signs and stuff like that around the museum. There are rails to guide canes. There are a lot of other little features that most guests at the museum wouldn't see, but that make it an accessible experience even for a visually impaired user. So we're pretty happy about that work, but there is always more to do. So here are those Pope.tech results. You'll see that we were ranked 3 out of Kansas, in the whole state of Kansas. We have an error density of 0.06, so it was pretty low, and the couple of schools that are ahead of us are also doing very well. We ranked 2 at the very bottom, 2 for schools in our size bracket from 10 to 20,000, and 5 in the plains. So we were pretty excited about those results. You can go to this website, 4k.pope.tech, and put in your own institution and take a look at where you stack up. On this slide deck, if you're here, you get the bonus of all of the links I put in here. So in Kansas, we have set up an organization website called the Kansas Accessibility Resources Network. That's ksarn.org. There's no reason you can't use this even if you're not in Kansas. It has the text size stickers, and I told you you'll be able to download the PSD files for Photoshop so that you can make changes to it and put your own versions up. There's also a lot of free trainings that are awarding currently Credly. We're in the process of moving to Acclaim, but badges so that you can have some proof of having completed those trainings. Several of these, like accessible face-to-face presentations, creating accessible digital documents, those were actually created initially to be included in classes, because one of the things that is a real gotcha in trying to make accessible instruction is that the instructors and the publishers aren't the only ones producing content that's used in class as instructional material. We also have to worry about what the students create. So if we have a class in which students are looking at each other's English papers, those need to be accessible. So we need to give those students training on how to do that accessibly. And in most cases, the faculty aren't in a position to give that training. So we created these badges so that the faculty could require that the student earn that badge and then move on. So that's the impetus for a lot of that stuff. Most of these are very high level. For anyone on this call, I wouldn't recommend the introduction to web accessibility, even though it's one I actually did myself, and you would get to continue to hear my voice. But it is really, really a beginner's introduction to web accessibility and web code in general. So you might use that for people who are just getting into managing content in your content management system, but it's not certainly for your coders. We also have some of the resources that are available through the Wichita State site. We have an accessibility area which has a resources page. We have some discussion about the legal landscape and accessibility standards for face-to-face instruction. And then you can also see links to our policies. And then I recommend WebAIM. Now, I should have pointed out when we talked about Pope Tech, the actual reviewer that Pope Tech is using is WebAIM's website accessibility thing. And WebAIM is a organization that is sort of the internet standard for a lot of these things. So it's very, very useful to take a look at the standards that they have and the information they have. And then there's some information on getting really fancy with some CSS that addresses oral style sheets and the ARIA guidelines and that sort of thing. So I'm going to skip right through accessibility and let's go to questions. What kind of questions can I answer for you?
John, what is the height of the letters for the whiteboard sign?
The standard is it needs to be at least 2 inches high, and it needs to be an inch high for every 10 feet of usable space in the room. So you go to the most far back chair from the screen and measure the distance to the screen or to the whiteboard, and every 10 feet it requires an inch. So we actually went around and measured that distance and put up an appropriate size sticker. The technician who was doing that was going around with a Johnny Appleseed bag of stickers at different sizes and just putting stuff up.
If you do have any further questions for John, please go ahead and just submit those in the question box.
Well, how about you, Deb? Did I confuse you with anything?
No, but I would say it was very consistent. We were just in North Dakota last week and listening to the state schools there. They had gathered together to talk about accessibility and just a lot of similarities that
Sure.
They have institutions at all stages of the journey, some that are doing fairly well. Angela Jackson came up from South Dakota and gave a great conversation about what they've done at their institution. But there are folks that are just getting started. There are folks that are much further along in the journey. And essentially the message was we're all in this together, and the more we can network and convene and share resources and thoughts, the better off we all will be.
that's really the impetus for that KSARN site that we have. We're really trying to, we have had to learn a lot in the past several years as we've tried to do what we need to do to get to where we've agreed to be. And there's no reason why everybody else should have to learn that from scratch the way we've had to in a lot of cases. And I mean, this high-end STEM tactile graphics work that we've had to do to meet the needs of a student taking upper division biology classes, it's each one of those graphics can take a couple of hours to create. They need to be a line drawing in Illustrator that can then be printed and then run through a device to on special paper. The device is called well, we use it's called a picture in a flash, but the technology is swell paper. Wherever there's a black line on the paper swells and it creates a ridge that is feelable. So then you have turned that drawing into something that people can feel. It's very labor intensive work to get that done. The team has been doing it for a couple of years and they've built up some speed and some techniques with it. But I mean, in a lot of those cases, if we're talking about the cross section of a shark or something like that, a text description isn't going to convey enough information for the student. And we really need to give them something that they can feel and then they can apply when they start trying to work on dissection and that sort of thing. So students can succeed in a lot of these classes if we can just provide them the right materials.
I did have a question come in. There is a difference of opinion. The university prefers PDF per document, but there is an opinion that maybe Word is better. So what is your opinion between those two formats?
Yeah, so what I often recommend, especially for faculty at Wichita State, is Word documents. For years, we have been recommending both. So if you're going to put up your syllabus, put up a Word document version and a PDF version. Now that we have Blackboard Ally and it will produce a PDF on the fly, we can say, okay, just put up a Word document. And part of the reason for that is Ally is actually a little better at transitioning between Word and its alternative formats than it is with PDF. PDF is a very, very accessible format for a document when it is well constructed. And it is really, really easy to create a PDF that is completely wrong or has no tags at all and is very, very inaccessible. And the punchline is it is very, very difficult to work with Adobe's tools or with other, there are some third-party tools you can get to help, but it can be more difficult to make that PDF accessible. So depending upon the use, we usually try and recommend that if you're creating a PDF that's a flyer, make it a web page. If you need to have something that you can print and hand out that way, make that alternative version that you print, but also in that include information about how to get it on the web. And what we usually do, is include a QR code in a flyer that will lead people back to the web page that has the alternative version of that content. And if you're always doing that in a consistent place, bottom right corner, that sort of thing, then people will be able to understand where that is and get a flyer and use their phone to target that. You don't even need, on most of your modern smartphones, need special software to read a QR code. The camera alone will read the quick QR codes and go out to the page that you're referencing. So it's a complicated question to answer. A lot of times there are PDFs that have to be forms, but what you really need to do if you're going to be putting up PDFs is develop the expertise that you need in how to make those PDFs accessible. And for most of our users, Word documents are easier to get through.
There was just a comment that one of our attendees, they're doing a presentation on Zoom instruction tomorrow for their faculty. So and they very helpful and very crucial right now, which I'm glad we were able to do that.
Yep. I think you put that concept of the limited audience and knowing specifically who they all are, that gives us permission to provide that video without captions, and that's a lifesaver in this particular ugly situation.
Yes, it is. Okay. I don't see any other questions coming in, and we are pretty much out of time. So I think at this point, again, thank you, John, so much for doing this. I know in this time frame,
Oh, yeah.
as you said, adequate is okay, and we appreciate your adequate very much.
Thank
and
you.
your willingness to share the story. And I personally thank you for letting me share your story with North Dakota last week. They were very interested as well. So we hope we've given everybody some tools that can help. I noticed, as you said, for your Zoom instructions, I have some faculty members that I work with regularly, and they're learning as they go as well. Please remember to fill out our survey at the end of this webinar and let us know how we did. And feel free to contact MEC if there's any additional information or services we can provide for you in this area, or if you have any suggestions on additional materials and things like that. You can see MEC's phone number and a webpage on the slide, and you can also see my email address. And John, I think your email was on the first slide.
It was, yeah.
Yes. So
It's
if you
really
do have any
easy.
additional yeah. If you do have any additional questions or want to get in contact with us as follow-up to this webinar, please feel free to do so. We absolutely welcome your questions. So once again, thank you very much and have a great afternoon.
Thanks.